Interbioregional trade, trade occurring between bioregions. Preliminarily, such trade is already capable of being limited via the plausibility of a wide variety of foods and other crops being grown within every bioregion. We are not, in other words, where we were centuries ago, wherein the growth of basic foods and non-food crops was largely limited to whatever so happened to have been within the bioregion, sans any human activity whatsoever. The aim is to limit the necessity of interbioregional trade, to enable every bioregion to produce sufficiently for itself insofar as such is plausible, thereby maximally producing within each bioregion, which de facto entails maximal productivity on a global scalar, as well as such goods as sustainability of practices, efficiencies in labor, not money, markets, enhanced quality of life, etc. These goods and others of the Moneyless Free Labor Society are expanded upon later in this piece. What is bad about interbioregional trade? Inefficiency in the movement of goods and services. This is a labor perspective, but then of course we are and ought to be primarily concerned about economies from a labor perspective. The inefficiency is the pointlessness of moving goods or services. If a good or service can be provided for within a bioregion, the moving of those goods or services from a different bioregion is wasteful of the labor and generally wasteful of resources, as the transportation of goods and services generally also entails the usage of resources. It creates jobs in a profoundly negative sense, creating superfluous labor, which is not a positive thing from any reasonable perspective. In an important sense, such movement of the labor to other bioregions also deprives the bioregion of meaningful work. Though that particular point has to be tempered by the material good that can and does accrue from interbioregional trade. Overall, an aim might be said to provide for a plethora of possibilities as to exactly what kinds of labor are available for people to do, while at the same time acknowledging that the good associated with industrial processes to provide for material goods and services has the potential to lessen the labor involved overall in the system. It is worth noting as to why interbioregional trade is or ever was a thing. Historically, interbioregional trade was of very significant value, as each bioregion was essentially isolated from all other bioregions. Trade between them enabled the exchange of goods and services that were not available within a given bioregion. That kind of labor is valuable. In the current, this kind of situation is effectively, falsely, placed as arbitrary limit upon the trade system, in order to create the effect of trade value. Arbitrary barriers that are constructs of human hands, human labor, in order to create the illusory effect of a value of trade. It is akin to a protection racket, an organization placing barriers up in order that it can thereby charge folks for the value they bring by moving the goods or services across the barrier they themselves create. Granted, it is a bit more complex than that. For one thing, there are actually multiple organizations functionally operating together to make that kind of arrangement happen, and no, they are not necessarily at any rate doing so in any particularly conspiratorial manner. Rather, such is better understood as a kind of grand and poor performance of trade continuing beyond the functional usefulness of the value of trade. A kind of desperation on their part to keep things going by action as if there were a great value in their labor. Folks ought be able to relate this to the notions espoused by free trade advocates, however, while there are similarities involved in the rhetorical aspects. I would seriously caution people to not mistake this for a claim of free trade advocacy. Indeed, the bioregionally restrained nature of the structure here is, well, not antithetical to free trade, certainly not compatible with it, and the argument here of trade in the current as performance, a protection racket, and little more, applies strongly to the case, theory, and practice of free trade as a concept within a moneyed society. This point likely cannot really be overstressed in the current. There used to be value in the kind of trade that is going on now, but now there simply isn't that value there anymore. The value of trade was the movement of goods and services that were not available in one bioregion to another. In the current, the barriers that prevent goods and services from being made available in differing bioregions are all human constructs, predicated upon the supposed need to make money, predicated upon the mere symbologies of money, rather than the value of trade. Some of this will be touched upon later in this piece. Here briefly note that such things as copyright laws are among the biggest kinds of constructed barriers, whereby this sort of performance of trade as if it had value occurs. Indeed, gentler readers ought to be able to grasp at the point as it is being made in a variety of ways throughout this piece. To be fair to the free trade advocates, the libertarian types, the strong suggestion here is that if we understand things from the perspective of the real economy, via the removal of the tool of money, we exactly end up with something like a moneyless free labor society as a free trade model. Rather than the free movement of capital in the abstraction, the free movement of literal symbols around, we are largely speaking of the free movement of materials and labor around. Granting, of course, there are serious restraints being put on a notion of total freedom of the movement of labor and materials, nonetheless I would strongly suggest that free trade advocates understand this piece from that perspective. In regards to any goods or services that remain unproducible within a given bioregion, such interbioregional trade, to supply those goods or services remain a plausible, but not unqualified, good. The qualification to such trade as being a good has a lot to do with the nature of surplus labor in the system. If the hands of labor determine that the labor isn't worth the goods and services so provided, then the goods or services fail to meet the qualifications to be considered good to provide. The particulars therein are complex and likely cannot be determined from on high. The notion of the Moneyless Free Labor Society is that freely chosen labor, sans the distorting effects of money, does a good job sussing that kind of surplus labor out. The hands of labor are capable of determining such things. In the more current times, however, interbioregional trade is considered valuable because it is cheaper, in terms of money, not labor, not efficiency of a system, not because the good or service couldn't be produced locally, but simply because it was cheaper in terms of money to make the good or provide the service elsewhere, and ship it, either physically or virtually via the internets all around the world. Such practices may, and almost inherently do, entail more labor, utilization of more resources, take longer to produce and distribute, and in a meaningful sense tend to entail lower quality of goods, incentivize worse labor practices, and so forth. When the only metric utilized is a moneyed one, that is, it costs less in terms of the moneyed price paid for the good or service for the persons consuming it, and hence de facto that it costs less in terms of moneyed price paid by the producer of said good or service, all other metrics therein can go to the wayside of concern. Such practices are simply crazy. There is no real more gentle word for it. Although there are any number of examples to point to, among the more exemplary egregious examples in the current of this crazy practice is the raising of cattle and crops, in the location of the Amazon forest. To do this, the tragedy of cutting down the forest is itself of high note. Such is so damaging to the ecosystem on a global scale that the catastrophes that would follow from it if the practice isn't stopped are well beyond anything in the human historical experience. That in and of itself is crazy. It would be a bit less crazy if they were producing that food to feed the local population. However, the local population doesn't need that food. The local population is already well fed. They weren't starving and making some big desperate decision to feed themselves. They made the decision in order to make money. Specifically, in order to ship the overwhelming majority of all such foods so produced to other countries. Doesn't really matter which other countries, beyond noting that they are thousands of miles away. And of course those countries all have the capacity to grow all of those foods themselves, and moreover, exactly none of those countries actually need the food. Again, these countries are also not starving. Indeed, all of them have the highest quality and widest variety of foods ever made available in the entire history of the species, and all of them already have a vast overabundance of food in the sense that even though by and large these countries overeat, there are still massive wastes of food within them. Folks growing crops and raising animals in the Amazon forest to feed people in far-flung bioregions who are starving wouldn't be nearly so crazed. That isn't what is happening is indicative of the issues involved with trade when done for reasons related to the utilization of the tool of money to do so. Starving people, after all, are almost certainly money poor, and hence they can't afford to pay for the food. But then, the point of the food is to eat, the point of trade is to provide for people who lack something, etc. There are of course plausible reasons as to why people ought not cut down the Amazon forest to feed people anywhere. Again, there are extremely serious consequences for doing so on a local, bioregional, and global scale that tends towards bads for the human species itself, as well as a large majority of other species on the planet. Doing so to feed starving people in some far-flung bioregion would at least be less crazed. Doing so for the pure symbology of money is maximally crazed, as it serves almost no purpose whatsoever. Perhaps more damningly put, it services the symbology of money and nothing else, as if worshipping an idol. Such practically exemplifies the issues associated with ecologies and economies of abundance. The overworking, overproducing, and overusing of resources. It could be argued that by doing so the people local to the growing and raising of animals make money, and thereby improve their quality of life. However, materially speaking, this isn't different from what is being proposed here. That same or higher quality of life is plausibly attainable simply by removing the tool of money as the metric whereby the material goods and services are provided. That is, the labor being done there isn't generating any kind of material good or service for the people directly. Hence it isn't the case that absent that labor the people there would directly lose any material good in the process. There are of course indirect goods that trade can provide, but the point here is that in a moneyless free labor society those indirect goods are still provided. The labor being described here is maximally crazed because it doesn't provide goods or services to places that need, or in some meaningful sense even want or desire it, nor does it provide for the local populace's needs, wants or desires. And on top of that, to do the trade requires the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, which causes local, bioregional, and biorealm, and worldwide problems. So, to say that for the locals doing the relevant labor involved in cutting down the Amazon and growing crops, raising farm animals, etc., are thereby gaining jobs or gaining wealth, in the sense of moneyed concerns, is to completely miss the reality of what is happening. To argue over the point of exactly who is gaining the moneyed wealth fails to address the relevant point of who is gaining in material goods and services. Moreover, in terms of jobs, of the labor being done, such is not by necessity anything to be proud of. Pointless labor is pointless. Labor that fails to meet the needs, wants and desires of the laborers or the local populace, let alone something as altruistic as the relevant needs, wants and desires of a non-local populace, is labor done in bad faith. In other words, the generation of wealth in terms of moneyed concerns is not the same thing as the generation of material wealth in terms of goods and services provided. The issues associated with capitalistic, or indeed communistic, socialistic, etc., concerns as they relate to the distribution of wealth as a moneyed concern are largely missing the point. In essence, they are mistaking the tool of measurement, money, for the thing being measured, labor, material goods and services, quality of life, etc. Worse still, they are utilizing a tool that provides poor measurements. A moneyless free labor society points towards the direct distribution of goods and services using the metrics of needs, wants and desires of people generalized, constrained via the relevant joint carving of bioregions, and utilizing the tool of data as the relevant means of measurement. The rationale for why trade ought to occur, whereby trade provides for the improvement of the quality of lives of people, actually matters as to how the goods and services are distributed. At best, the argument for the use of the tool of money is only that it provides for a higher quality of life in terms of material goods and services. The factual reality, however, is that the use of the tool of money doesn't actually distribute the goods and services in a manner that improves the quality of lives of people in general. It merely creates piles of symbols, that is, piles of money, because the collecting of money becomes the aim, and only secondarily does it have any relation to the distribution of goods and services. To be perfectly blunt about it, since the species knows that trade improves the quality of lives of the people so traded with, then it follows that simply doing the trade with the direct aim of providing those goods and services to other people is by far a more efficient methodology of trade. That the species can now do such trade en masse only entails the capacity for the species to en masse increase the quality of lives of people. Perhaps it is worthwhile to hammer on that point a bit more, for the benefit of those caught up in the illusory nature of money and the arcane arguments of the economists. Material wealth is not money. Material wealth accrues through the production and distribution of material goods and services. The example of the Amazon forest is apt for displaying this point. Money as a motivating factor in the current is providing the incentives to cut down the forests, grow the crops, and raise the animals on the lands there. However, by doing so no one there is actually increasing their material wealth in terms of material goods and services. Rather, at best, they are increasing their money supplies. Generating, in other words, more money. What they can do with that money, ultimately, is utilize it to obtain other goods and services that someone else produces. That is, they can trade for it. To be clear, the material goods and services being provided are not being provided to the people within the bioregion by and large at any rate. Hence, they are not actually increasing their material wealth. In real terms, in the most meaningful of senses, they are decreasing their material wealth. The problem, of course, is that those other people to whom they are trading with likewise are producing goods and services for the same reason: to make money, which at best is utilized to obtain material goods and services for someone else to trade. Again, insofar as interbioregional trade is providing some material good or service that is not available within a given bioregion, such trade increases the material wealth of each bioregion participating in the trade. But trade as such doesn't actually inherently increase the material wealth of a given bioregion. There is the other major caveat to this point, namely that trade can and does enable specialized labor to produce specialized material goods and services, but trade as such, especially trade utilizing the tool of money, has exactly no inherent value to it. Worse still, such trade decreases the material wealth within the bioregions that participate in it. To continue on the point, when each person doing the trading is doing so to obtain money as if it were a direct substitute for material wealth, neither person doing the trading is actually increasing their wealth in terms of material goods and services. They're just moving money around rather pointlessly, and worse still, moving actual material goods and services around rather pointlessly in order to obtain more money to move more material goods and services around rather pointlessly. Such constitutes a basic collective action problem. For each person, the belief is that they can obtain more material goods and services by gathering together more money, and for each such is technically the case, so long as everyone plays along and pretends that money has actual value to it. However, on the whole, when everyone does this, the actual material goods and services, not the money, decreases rather than increases for most people. Moreover, what is actually doing the labor in the system that either potentially or actually increases the material wealth of people is poorly structured. In other words, the labor becomes non-productive in terms of supplying anything like material wealth for people, as the chase becomes about money, not material wealth as such. This aspect is in some ways most obvious as it relates to financial sectors of the current economy. This isn't to suggest that there is anything wrong with trade, and it isn't to suggest that there has been no value to the utilization of the tool of money to facilitate trade in a wide variety of ways. It is to point out serious flaws and limitations of the tool of money. Ultimately, money is a whip that is used to force people to do this or that thing. Among the fundamental questions being raised in this piece is, do we really need a whip? Again, there is nothing particularly special about the example of the Amazon forest. Much of global trade, and perhaps most of global trade, is like this. More detailed and to the point, beyond the global aspect as such, this largely applies to all interbioregional trade. The difference of note therein is that these same kinds of issues are present regardless of the distance traveled for the trade, but that the shortening of supply lines mitigates all those kinds of issues. Trading between adjacent bioregions suffers the same issues. If the goods or services can be produced within a bioregion, there is very good reason to suspect that they ought not be shipped in even from adjacent bioregions. Throughout this piece, these kinds of absurdities are highlighted in broad strokes as they are applicable to a wide variety of economic sectors. Beyond the simple crazed absurdity of this practice, there are ecological reasons and long-term sustainability reasons to not do this. Of the former, utilizing a bioregion to feed all other bioregions doesn't work. This ought to be obvious. A bioregion cannot realistically feed all other bioregions in general in a sustainable manner. When the food so produced is shipped to any other given bioregion predicated on little more than who is willing to pay for it, the results are so predictable and so in the current know by everyone that it is hardly worth noting it at this point. Still, let's take the time to outline one fairly well understood point historically. When this kind of practice is done, those bioregions that produce the relevant crops and raise the animals in order to ship them elsewhere, those bioregions tend to die out in terms of human populations. The reason being not because people dislike living there or because they prefer to live somewhere else. Rather, the reason being because they chase after the money that becomes centralized within centers of trade. Hence, for instance, we witness the hollowing out of every country in the current, the fleeing of people from the rural lands, and the movement of goods and services to cities and megacities. Places that in actuality few people prefer to live in, but by necessity to find a job in order to make money, are effectively forced to live in. A good historian would note that these kinds of issues used to be in the relevant dialogues and to some extent remain within them. Note the relationship between a given bioregion and its adjacent bioregions is more interconnected, and trade between these more apt. It is true that some bioregions are more or less productive in terms of capacity to grow the relevant crops, raise the relevant livestock, or have the relevant existing wild stocks of the same, and it is worthwhile to ship goods and services insofar as those are not capable of being produced locally. However, most bioregions are actually very capable of producing sufficient goods and services for themselves, and the bioregionally constrained structure of the Moneyless Free Labor Society entails the maximal output of each bioregion primarily, insofar as they are not capable of producing sufficiently for themselves. Adjacent bioregions are generally capable. In an important sense, the joint carving along bioregional grounds definitionally entails that some degree of goods and services that cannot be produced within a given bioregion can be produced within an adjacent bioregion. The reason being that what can and cannot be grown within a given bioregion is determined exactly along bioregional grounds. The bioregional environment largely determines what can and cannot be grown. It is critical to understand that all bioregions produced adequate goods and services for themselves sans human intervention, that there is some population maximum therein. Such isn't to suggest that there ought not be human intervention within a bioregion. Regardless of how we view it, the human species has the capacity within a bioregion to improve its productive capacities. Moreover, there is of course value in interbioregional trade, again, insofar as such entails supplying goods and services that are not capable of being produced within any given bioregion. The capacity of the human species to intervene, in other words, towards the improvement of the quality of their lives, and de facto to increase the population limit that the bioregion would otherwise provide. Understanding in sum that human intervention within a bioregion is not necessarily a bad. In theory, principle and practice, such intervention within a bioregion can improve upon the existing bioregion's capacity to provide, not merely for themselves, but also towards the bioregion as a whole. The tensions involved are significant, and clearly that capacity can take on crazed proportions, especially when the capacity to do so is too heavily geared towards the supposed aims of the species to care for themselves. In other words, by self-centeredly focusing on the human species' needs, wants and desires, the needs, wants and desires of the bioregion as a whole falter, which ultimately fails to meet the needs, wants and desires of the human species. Such amounts to the difference between utilizing the capacity of the human species within a scarcity of productive capacity, but an abundance of resources, whereby the drive to increase productive capacities towards the increasing in the quality and quantity of the human species is proper, and that of utilizing the capacity of the human species within an abundance of productive capacity, but a scarcity of resources. Such is the relevant tension in place, and again, in this kind of abundance of productive capacity, the relevant methodology to increase the overall abundance entails restoration of the bioregions, the restoration of the resources available to be utilized. It is vaguely paradoxical in the sense that to increase overall abundance one ought to reduce the productive human processes. But really any sense of paradox involved amounts to people too used to short-term productive capacities. See the lazy fisherfolk subsection and elsewhere in this piece for examples of this. It is also critical to understand that global trade and indeed even intrabioregional trade is super new, in the sense of anything like it being done en masse. Such practices have of course existed in a far more limited capacity for plausibly as long as the human species has been around. But the species didn't begin industrial capacity to do so until roughly the era of European colonialism. The fact that such practices are so new to the species is important to note, both because people in the current may not really have the conceptualization in mind, what they experience in their lives may be mistaken as for how things have always been, and because as something that is so new, the species really ought to distinguish between the kinds of practices that are pertinent to create such a system, and the proper kinds of practices to sustain such systems. Global trade, trade in general, is not a bad. The species may and ought to look upon the historical practices that created the capacity of en masse trade, with all its horrors and goods intact, as distinct from the practices that are proper for maintaining it. En masse interbioregional trade, in other words, perhaps had of itself something very much like colonialism as a relevant practice to create the systemization in the first place. But the continuation of the practices used to create the system are not only not relevant towards its maintenance, they are very likely harmful to its maintenance. As it relates to this piece, the argument is, in essence, that utilization of the tool of money, the whip of money, to spur on such practices as interbioregional trade may have been pertinent. At the least, given the relevant historical reality, the utilization of the tool of money is what people had at their disposal to use, specifically as a means of payment for folks that don't really produce anything aside from the movement of goods and services, from one place to another, or more generally, to provide for people to do something aside from in essence, subsistence farming, hunting and gathering, etc. However, once those systemizations of trade have been established, the continuation of the use of money as a tool is irrelevant, and worse than irrelevant, harmful, as it tends to produce literally crazed and destructive results. Likewise, it is again worth really drilling into the readers' heads that the fundamental rationale for trade is the transporting of goods and services that are not available in another location, more pointedly, that are not capable of being produced in another bioregion, or not capable of being sufficiently produced within a bioregion. Wherein sufficiently produced is a metric understood from the balancing of labors to goods and services outlined and explained throughout this piece. Most bioregions already have the capacity of producing these goods and services themselves. wherein they don't have that capacity, make it so to solve the issues of interbioregional trade. Where such is not a plausible alternative, such defines the good associated with interbioregional trade. Likewise, it is important for readers to note the importance of diversity of cultures. Such entails the differentiation of availability of various goods and services. It is not necessary or perhaps even desirable to have all the same goods and services available in each and every bioregion. At its core, this amounts to the incapability of some places to really produce different kinds of foods or raise different kinds of animals. Moreover, it entails the primary utilization of local resources, building a local culture via the resources primarily available within a given bioregion. The value of this is somewhat ephemeral but is worthwhile. Beyond any kind of pragmatics of economies, here we are speaking of qualities of life, as in the quality of life that accrues through living in and visiting differing cultures. It is rather depressing, after all, to go to a supposedly different culture only to find that they're basically doing the same dumb shit, eating the same foods, living the same lifestyle, etc. This point is given some greater attention in the Renewal of Cultures subsection. Such, of course, doesn't negate the value of interbioregional trade. It's simply delimited to what is actually necessary and/or desirable. Beyond the shall we say, performance economy issue, there are some real pragmatic concerns regarding the usage of non-renewable resources. The scare quotes are there because technically all resources are renewable, they just may renew at a rate that is far longer than anything we are really generally taking into consideration within the lifetime of a person, or indeed, within the lifetime of what is generally considered as reasonable to consider. Call such non-renewables slow renewables. These are of course technical issues, with specifics applicable to each slow renewable resource. However, I do want to suggest that if we accept the following premise, if folks want to continue this species, which they don't have to, then it pretty straightforwardly follows that these slow renewable resources ought to be constrained in their use to the rate of their renewal. For some resources there is in fact such abundance that it likely is not really a serious concern: dirt, rare earths, various kinds of common rock, etc. Though even those, it is worth noting that there are generally other ecological concerns associated with their use. Very often there are ecological harms of a serious sort that accrue through their mass productive use. Hence, though we may not be particularly concerned about running out of those resources, we ought to be seriously concerned about the harms to our other resources that accrue through their productive use. Other slow renewables that are far more rare ought to be considered as global property. That is, common earth goods. Let's note that in some sense this is true in the current, so folks ought not necessarily read the common earth goods as a communistic claim. When a slow renewable is offered up on the open market to whomever may pay monies for it, technically at any rate it is a common earth good. Anyone could technically buy it. The question is, how do we treat, handle, and distribute common earth goods, not if they are common earth goods at all. This point is perhaps crucial for people to understand within the current, as, on the one hand, the reader may construe that it is privately held property in the hands of Corporation X, and on the other hand the reader may construe that it is owned by the state that controls the bioregion within which the slow renewable is present. Neither of these are correct on a pragmatic or ethical level. slow renewables insofar as they are controlled by Corp X, after all, simply sells them off to basically anyone. Likewise, slow renewables controlled by State Gov X simply sell them off to anyone. Their priorities may shift a bit depending on who exactly is doing the selling, but ultimately either X group sells them to others because they are in essence common earth goods. The pragmatics involved in utilizing such slow renewables entails that they are not really even useful to the persons selling them as such. That is, they only gain their usefulness insofar as they are sold to others to utilize. Selling them to others being more than just the end-use customers of the products, selling to others also includes, and indeed primarily entails, selling them to other Corp XS and Gov XS so that they can utilize them. Another good way for the reader to wrap their brains around this is that there is such an abundance of these slow renewables that no owner of them could ever even hope to utilize them themselves. To hold that they are owned by one particular person or entity, in other words, entails that they are inherently radically underutilized. This point goes beyond the issues of the slow renewables, as it is applicable in a meaningful sense to the faster renewables, such as the fishes of the oceans or the trees of the forests. What this points to, however, is not the unrestrained open trade, especially as they relate to the utilization of moneyed concerns as the metric of trade. It points again to the constrained interbioregional trade, the imperative to stay within the renewal rates, and the importance of understanding that ownership of common earth goods is not a proper methodology for understanding such resources. In the current, the metrics of capitalism, insofar as it is understood as freely chosen labor, rather than the free movement of capital, is the proper modality of understanding the hows and whys for the distribution of these kinds of goods and services. The argument here being presented, of course, is that simply by the removal of the tool of money as a mechanism of controlling freely chosen labor is sufficient, and indeed, more than merely sufficient, is a good for the species. Many slow renewables that are valuable primarily as a matter of aesthetics ought not generally be used for such. This particular aspect is covered elsewhere in the real concerns of a moneyless free labor society, in brief simply noting that in a moneyless society, these of course have exactly zero monetary value. Their usefulness to society as a matter of course is in terms of their capacity of use within technology. The modality of conservation of these resources within a moneyless society is also covered in the Real Concerns of a Moneyless Free Labor Society section. In this section we are primarily concerned with how to treat them as a matter of trade goods towards the betterment of societies in general. What constitutes reasonable interbioregional trade, in other words? The broadest of strokes are really all that is required for all these kinds of materials as regards trade. They are common goods of the earth. Their use and trade, in other words, ought to be towards the betterment of the quality of all people's lives, and they are freely available for interbioregional trade. As a subset of understanding on this point, these goods are not necessarily in the control of the bioregion that so happens to have them. Wherein control in this sense is the determination as to whom those resources are given. Given that these renew over such a long period, and that their usefulness to all bioregions is roughly equal, see the other broad strokes outlined here, there is no reasonable rationale as to why they would be under the control of the people who happen to live near them. That said, there is good reason for the people living near them to have control as to if and how said goods are extracted. specifically as such concerns may relate to cultural significance and/or ecological concerns, be those ecological concerns locally or globally relevant, and in terms of the labor involved in extracting them. To be a bit blunt about it, the potential usefulness of the resource extraction to some other bioregion doesn't bestow any particular right to do so wherein doing so harms the bioregion wherein the extraction is taking place. Here there is an important sense of gift-giving and generosity on the part of everyone involved. If there is no particular ecological or cultural harm involved, there is no real valid reason to not extract the material for use elsewhere. Such amounts to something like the following principle: extractability is assumed valid, provided that there is no serious cultural or ecological harm involved, wherein cultural or ecological harm is determined by the people within the bioregion wherein extraction is to take place, rather than some abstracted other entity. Recalling that within a moneyless society, greed is generally not a factor. People generally will not seek to extract materials simply as a matter of making money, there being no money after all. This point is expanded upon later in this piece. Nor for that matter will people within the bioregion generally stop extraction simply as a matter of wanting money. More generally speaking, as each bioregion as such is maximally self-sufficient for meeting their own needs, wants and desires, the impetus to extract from other bioregions is significantly ameliorated. Moreover, from the hands of labor, the impetus to extract more is significantly restricted. While this deserves some explanation, in the crux of the matter, such as because doing so entails more labor, which the laborers would rather not do if it can be helped, and unless doing so actually improves quality of life and/or reduces overall labor. Of the latter point, among the most relevant examples is as technology reduces the overall labor involved. Hence, extracting various resources to produce labor-saving technologies is a general good in the eyes of labor. Consider such from the perspective of the laborer within this bioregionally constrained systemization. Out of hand, my needs are met. I work, but I have free access to all the goods and services available within the bioregion. Moreover, all the goods and services within my bioregion are primarily the product of, if not my labor directly, the labor of someone within my bioregion of primary concern. Hence, the laborer knows that to overconsume is to create more labor primarily within the bioregion within which I live. As a matter of metrics, depending on how literally we take this, the more that people consume, the more hours I am literally required to labor, and not just me, but everyone else within the bioregion. Hence, the laborers' incentives are to make do, to maintain their existing products, to craft things that last longer, to not overuse energy, in the sense of electrical energy, as that too increases the overall labor load. If I am too cold, I tend to put on warmer clothes, use curtains to insulate windows, learn to like the cold a bit, get under the covers, etc. If I am too hot, I tend to wear less clothing, open windows, learn to appreciate the heat, maybe go outside more, etc. If it's daytime, I don't turn on the lights in the house. If it's nighttime, I don't have lights on in the house that I don't need. Note how all those kinds of incentives go out the window in a moneyed society, wherein the only concern is how much can you afford. The laborer still enjoys niceties, finer things in life, quality living, etc. They may want a car, but they aren't really looking to upgrade their car every year, and generally so too for all technologies. Good enough is functional for my needs, wants and desires. We may note that the laborer with time and resources to do so is likely to upgrade their cars and all other property on their own. The laborer is conscientious regarding consumption of limited resources. After all, these primarily come from my own bioregion. Insofar as these kinds of resources don't, on the one hand they are commonly shared goods, and on the other hand the fact that they are limited is a well-known fact. If the laborer wants to continue using them, they ought to use them wisely. There is therein an incentive to find other methodologies that are not so limited, as such entails a greater capacity for quality living for the laborer. But after all, I'm just a laborer. I leave those kinds of things to other people, the technologist, the smarty-pants, the technicians, etc. Moreover, all other laborers are just as incentivized, hence we all learn to maintain our own goods as best we can. Folks with the skills to repair are highly prized. After all, if the good can be repaired, all the better. The laborer doesn't care so much for disposable items. After all, each of those required labor and resources, again, primarily from within their bioregion. Far better to have durable items that last. Hence, when the laborer looks upon some far distant bioregion, in terms of trade, well, such is the last place they really look. They look there for necessity, not in the sense of merely meeting needs, but the necessity that meets the needs, wants and desires of the laborer. It's tempting for the reader to wonder if that addresses the concerns of the laborers within the bioregion of extraction, though note that all laborers have the same basic concerns. That attitudinal disposition is relevant for the laborer within the bioregion of extraction, though it doesn't exhaust their particular viewpoint. Such is, in other words, the underpinning view of the laborer that informs the laborer as it relates to the extraction of resources within their own bioregion, whereby they themselves are the ones primarily responsible for the relevant labor involved in that extraction. Who does that kind of extractive labor, and why would they? This kind of concern is legit and cuts to the heart of some of the issues regarding interbioregional trade, beyond merely trading with one's adjacent bioregions. There are a few motivational points therein. The bioregion within which such resources are located has their own incentives to utilize them. They are very likely to want to use them for their own purposes and to help supply the adjacent bioregions. Hence, they already have incentives to build and do the various labors of extracting and refining the resource. How much to supply to non-adjacent bioregions, and to which non-adjacent bioregions? The answer has at least two parts to it, and will also be dealt with in greater detail later in this section. On the one hand, the local bioregion determines such via concerns over the ecological integrity of the bioregion. Hence, in terms of how much they extract, they determine that themselves, though technically such is a quantifiable thing, staying within the renewal rates of the resources, and protecting the integrity of the local bioregion are technically quantifiable, and define the limits of extractive practices. On the other hand, the information regarding how much of that resource all non-adjacent bioregions need is also quantifiable, albeit in abstraction such quantifications are of little use. How much of a given resource is used is dependent upon what kinds of goods and services people are wanting. Within the Moneyless Free Labor Society, those kinds of concerns are largely addressed via the minimization of the use of resources, the primacy given to local and short supply lines, concerns of staying within the renewal rates of all resources, tendencies towards longer-term higher quality goods and services, tendencies towards maintaining one's existing goods and services, and the preference towards less labor outside the home. That said, such doesn't fully address the question. At some point there will be demand for those kinds of resources by non-adjacent bioregions, though it is important to recall the constraints of the system entails a minimization of those demands. Hence, part of the fears motivating this kind of concern are exactly addressed, specifically, the fears of overworking a given bioregion's population and overusing a given bioregion's resources towards the service of some non-adjacent bioregion. This will be detailed more fully via the open gift-giving market later in this section. Here we shall just note that the essence of why to the question amounts to a few nominal motivational aspects. 1. The creation of various labor-saving technologies entails this kind of trading of various slow-renewal rare resources. Hence, it is in the laborer's interests to trade with non-adjacent bioregions in order exactly to gain access to these kinds of labor-saving devices. 2. Very basics of trade, any given other bioregion may have something that any given other bioregion does not. Such isn't to suggest that absent any exportable goods a bioregion is thereby denied the capacity to import goods from elsewhere. It is simply to note a kind of boring global view about the reality of trade that such kinds of things are necessary and generally in everyone's best interests when properly constrained. 3. Inequalities in labor distribution. This is dealt with more fully later, but for here the notion is something like, folks living near various resources are being tasked with supplying those resources to others who don't need to work as much. It is something of a valid concern, however, it may be very overblown. That is, people in general will be working similarly in different locations. There may end up being variations in the number of hours worked by region relative to the local population. It is too difficult to determine exactly how unequal that kind of distribution would actually end up being to be perfectly honest about it. It is something to keep an eye out for in the system. That said, the overall structure is designed to suss out surpluses of labor in the current, and in the current everyone is working a lot. Recall that the first pass-through of the system doesn't make any particular suggestions regarding how or what labor will be marked as surplus labor, and suggests no changes via fiat regarding a reduction or increase in work hours. People doing the labor of extraction would expect, in other words, no changes in terms of overall hours worked. But like every other aspect of labor, as the surpluses in labor are identified, as surplus jobs are removed from the current system, the workforce can be shifted to other labors that are relevant, with the aim of reducing work hours within those systems. In other words, if the workforce is increased by 50% in a given field, the aim therein is to reduce the work hours of every laborer therein. Shorter work weeks, in other words, by additional labor within the relevant fields. Upshot therein being that folks may expect less workloads. Noting that in the current the imperative is exactly to work more, not less. To supply more, not less. Hence, insofar as the concern is exactly inequalities in distribution of labor, whereby a given bioregion is tasked to work more, the Moneyless Free Labor Society provides for a better sort of outcome than a moneyed society. 4. Insofar as a given bioregion has the capacity to do without these kinds of materials, they should. In other words, if the needs, wants and desires of a given bioregion are already met regarding what that material would otherwise provide, there is no point in utilizing them within that bioregion. Such kinds of trade fall in the crazy category of trade alluded to earlier, albeit with a bit of a spin to it in that we are largely speaking of differing technological capacities rather than production of pretty much the exact same goods and services. This point, therefore, can be a bit tricky. In other words, folks may hold that, for instance, utilization of beasts of burden on a farm is sufficient, so why bother trading for the goods or technology to create mechanized farm equipment? There are, however, aspects of the free labor's hands that deal with this. The lazy laborer has a preference, a desire and a want to work less hard, be more efficient in their labor, so that they can focus on other less difficult labors, or merely to focus on other hard labors that folks cannot ameliorate through their various techniques and technologies. That said, there is nothing really wrong with utilization of differing techniques, supposing of course that the local bioregion is meeting its needs, wants and desires. In other words, absent the imperative to work to live and its derivative, high-pressure sales tactics involved in the current model, it is highly probable that folks may in fact prefer other less technologically involved techniques. These kinds of concerns likewise point to the issue of toys, baubles, trinkets, etc. that are shipped around the globe. The point therein isn't to suggest that folks ought not have these kinds of things, but rather of course that shipping them around the globe is rather silly, wasteful, and harmful behavior. These kinds of practices in particular are very likely to stop via the hands of labor. There is simply little to no incentive to produce and ship such things around the globe in a moneyless free labor society. Moreover, such doesn't decrease the incentives to make such things locally. The emphasis is simply different in terms of where such things are produced. 5. Tit-for-tat playfulness. In terms of trade, there isn't really a sense in which there is an immediate exchange of goods or services. Such, after all, assumes a want that may not be present, and a sense of greed that definitely is not present. The gift giver gives the gifts, knowing and understanding of course that at some later time there may be the need to be the one doing the asking and the getting. Perhaps more profoundly, the gift giver gives because they understand that it is better to do so than not, for themselves and for everyone else. Doing so creates greater stability and prosperity in the world at large. 6. Primary use of these kinds of goods. The primary use is to exactly set the stage for each bioregion to become as self-sufficient as plausible. The major limiting factor thereof being, while maintaining a high quality of living, whereby such qualities are determined via freely chosen labor, as outlined throughout this piece. This involves such things as the construction of the machinery necessary to provide a given bioregion with the capacity to produce goods and services within the bioregion, primarily for the bioregion. 6a. What we would expect as an output thereof is a plethora of small factories, what used to be referred to as cottage industries, albeit with significant upgrades in terms of the technologies involved. However, due to the hands of labor, these kinds of factories are minimally small and hence minimally polluting, minimally using local resources, for all the reasons stated earlier and somewhat more elaborately stated in Section 12, Real Concerns of a Moneyless Free Labor Society, and Section 13, Real Benefits of a Moneyless Free Labor Society. These are, after all, not factories that intend to produce goods all over the world, or even necessarily for adjacent bioregions. though again the relationship between adjacent bioregions is far more intimate and pragmatically useful in terms of trade. Hence, some not insignificant number of these kinds of cottage industries will in fact be generally providing for exactly the bioregion they are in and all adjacent bioregions. Their far more modest aim of producing for the needs, wants and desires of their own bioregion entail a far more modest output, hence far more modest input. Moreover, the degree of output is seriously lessened per person, not through dictum or quota, but rather through the metric of the hands of labor. Both because the laborers involved in the production have their own reasons for wanting to not overproduce, namely, they do not want to do that kind of labor, but also because the consumers do not want to overconsume. As such ultimately entails them doing more labor too, either directly or indirectly. Wherein indirectly among other things entails failing to let the non-human laborers do their own labor, the destruction of the ecosystems which ultimately entails the laborers doing more labor. 6b. We'd also expect there to be a great increase in small family farms, increases in the populations of smaller towns and rural areas, etc., as people move from the far less productive, relevant or interesting big cities and mega-cities. Absent any particular reason to produce en masse goods and services for other bioregions, the rationale for huge centers of trade significantly diminishes. They're still needed, as there is still trade, and there likely is some need for at least some places to have large commercial centers, places wherein the interbioregional trade goods are extracted, processed, etc., are still required. What isn't required, or required very little of at any rate, are many of the various office spaces within large cities, as the significantly diminished value of interbioregional trade would entail that many various businesses associated with large cities would go away. Call such superfluous labor, after all, not something to be lamented for its loss. There would be many other significant changes in jobs generally speaking, such as given more attention though in Section 13, real benefits of a moneyless free labor society. 7. Centralized production of goods. It is important to note that the centralization of the production of at least some goods and services can provide for a greater value for everyone involved, most likely especially as regards technologies in particular. With a bit more specificity to that, as regards trades and production of goods that require high degrees of precision in technique, and/or those that require the utilization of resources from a large number of non-adjacent bioregions. This is of double importance as the emphasis ought to be and will tend towards the production of only high-quality durable goods and services within the system, especially as regards to goods, trades and services as they relate to slow renewable resources. In a very meaningful sense, I do not have the relevant expertise to discuss this technical point in any great detail, besides which the variation from industry to industry and bioregion to bioregion is too great to really cover in any significant detail within a single document. Importantly, though, that knowledge set does exist within the relevant industries themselves, and likely within various government agencies, universities, and other locations. It isn't, after all, like any of this is particularly mysterious at this point. That said, there are generalizable principles that ought to be followed, which do not necessarily grow from the hands of labor as such. 7a. Keep it as local as possible to the relevant source materials. In essence, keep supply lines to the relevant factories as short as possible. Roughly, this entails a principle of building factories that supply worked raw materials into usable materials for a wide variety of goods and services close to the point of extraction. Such is generally practiced as it is, but is good to note nonetheless. 7b. When it comes to technologies produced en masse, such as for instance car factories, it is honestly unclear to me in terms of efficiencies of use of resources overall as to if it is better to have very few of these and ship them around the globe, or for some broad set of bioregions to have one, etc. What is clear, though, is that they ought not be overproducing regardless, such as making new models every year, etc. Supplying for the needs, wants and desires of people is the aim, not en masse production as such. The relevant points therein have much to do with the movement of materials as inputs versus the movement of the finished products as outputs. As it currently stands, these kinds of factories are already existing, and there likely isn't a whole lot of good associated with moving them. There may, however, be some good in construction of new ones in key locations wherein they are not already existing, the construction of such factories in order to supply for the relative needs, wants and desires of bioregions wherein currently such goods and services are supplied by far distant bioregions. Such may also entail the closure and/or reduction of production capacity of some existing factories, as being redundant to the relevant goods and services. The rationale being these kinds of goods and services are currently being supplied by far distant bioregions, but no longer, and hence reduction or elimination of the factory. The aim, again, is to reduce overall interbioregional trade by making each bioregion as self-sufficient as possible, and overall shortening of interbioregional trade lines, as all such trade lines themselves utilize resources that are of the slow renewable kind, and such trade creates surplus labor within the system. 7c. Clean up after yourselves. There are incentives in the Moneyless Free Labor Society for industries and businesses to clean up after themselves, and there are fewer barriers that prevent such efforts. Of the former, that they are supplying and supplied by, primarily local productive capacities. To not clean up after themselves is to destroy their own supplies, their own capacity to be supplied, and their own living spaces. This also dovetails with the likely more local ownership in this systemization. Folks who do not live in a given bioregion have little incentive to keep the place tidy. Of the latter, the lack of money as a requirement means that there isn't a monetary barrier in place that prevents folks from keeping the place tidy. In other words, in the current that costs money, very oft lots of money. This means businesses and industries have rather large incentives to try and put those burdens on others, such as governments, or simply ignore it altogether. It being to them, after all, just an expense to be avoided. Despite these points, which I would say are pretty strongly favorable points for a moneyless free labor society, there is a real concern regarding the lazy worker that they may simply, be too lazy to clean up after themselves. I am assuming that folks reading this are adult enough to recognize that this is a real concern. The point here especially being that centralized industrial capacities entail potentially rather large messes to be cleaned up. Hence, there is a principle to follow, an ethic and norm of behavior that doesn't necessarily grow from the hands of labor. Keep it clean and tidy. Such is applicable to all businesses and industries, and this aspect in particular is examined elsewhere in this piece. 8. Spurious interbioregional trade. Each bioregion is capable of producing more than the bioregion needs, wants or desires, without necessarily degrading the bioregion. There is, after all, plenty of surplus, especially with our capacities of production being so great. There is nothing particularly wrong with trading these, that is, gifting them to other bioregions. The costs of doing so, however, ought to be measured in terms of the strain on the slow renewable resources required to do so. One plausible hopeful aspect therein is that by the mass reduction of pointless trade, we thereby enable the continuation of purposeful trade in the long run. That is simply something to be determined as the system itself takes shape, and is a matter of technologies that use less slow renewable resources, and the degree by which the world can get its collective head out their ass in regards to longer-term planning for the species. In the case of this proposal as a head-out-of-ass removal system, the demand for such goods is fairly well minimized, but it is not non-existent. After all, shipping apples around the world from a few locations, wherein apples can grow in many, many locations, entails that there is no need to ship apples. Local bioregions can just grow them themselves. Clothing and housing materials are generally available in every bioregion, insofar as they haven't foolishly destroyed them already, but then, they can be regrown if those bioregions stop trying to depend upon other bioregions for the materials. Moreover, the various techniques of buildings and clothing are available to everyone and anyone. It is primarily the foods, crops, and animals that can't really be grown in other bioregions, or ought not be grown in other bioregions. That is the aspect of trade of surplus of import as regards relatively quick renewables, the trade of slow renewables that are unevenly distributed within the global system, in order to create the kinds of factories, technologies, labor-saving devices, etc., constitute the other broad category of purposeful and worthwhile interbioregional trade. 9. Interbioregional trade of foods. Similar can be said of various processed foods, though the real need of shipping such goods is very unclear. Wine, for instance, can and is made in a great deal of locations, as can frozen foods, specialized candies, canned goods, etc. All have some significant value that people likely don't fully appreciate. Stored foods and certain specialized foods are quite important and useful for such things as not starving to death, not having en masse famines, etc. My suspicion therein, though, is that the same bioregionally constrained considerations largely deal with this issue. Insofar as we want, need, or desire these things, they ought to be produced in smaller factories that are geared towards supplying a given bioregion primarily, and very likely all adjacent bioregions, but not geared towards supplying non-adjacent bioregions. There are no obvious or unobvious reasons as to why this wouldn't generally be possible in the overwhelming majority of bioregions. Wheresoever such is not possible, gifting those kinds of goods to them seems perfectly reasonable. Likewise, wherein surpluses are generated within the constraints of the renewal rates of the bioregion, gifting those to other bioregions remains valid. 10. Such does raise the question regarding the priorities of such gift-giving practices. In the current, the metric used is who can afford them, which in what ought to be the non-surprise of all time, generates massive inequalities in the system overall. Within the Moneyless Free Labor Society, the priorities are markedly different. 10A. Adjacent bioregions first. This is a pragmatic concern towards the aim of relative self-sustainability of every given bioregion. 10B. Needs over wants and desires. Not really a difficult principle to follow. If there are starving people somewhere, give them foods, prioritize their needs. If there is no shelter available, prioritize those needs. In the longer run within this system, these kinds of concerns are going to have far more to do with catastrophes than endemic poverty as such. 10c. Secondarily, concerns regarding wants and desires. This is perhaps an area wherein the trading towards the ends of mutual satisfaction between non-adjacent bioregions remains in play. There isn't any particular reason why this or that bioregion ought to be supplied with additional goods and services, beyond the notion that folks within a given bioregion are likewise satisfying their own wants and desires by trading. Such still has to occur within the overall constraints regarding the relevant renewal rates of all the various resources, and it still has to be predicated upon primarily providing for the needs, wants and desires of the bioregion and the adjacent bioregion. To do otherwise is to create incentives to overproduce in hopes of merely trading with some other non-adjacent bioregion for their goods and services. Perhaps more to the point, such trading, as if it were being done in a direct manner, that is, as if it were being done as a matter of bartering, rather than being done as a part of the overall interbioregional trading systemization, is rather crucial to grasp at. The former is a rather myopic view of trading, something covered in greed and concerned for nationalistic power. The latter is a light-hearted global view. Really a fractally scalar view, but such is perhaps a bit much for the reader. The complexities involved with interbioregional trade, especially on a global scalar, are, well, they are globally complex. Not as a matter of the monies involved, nor the politics. Those concerns are petty, weak, somewhat childish and pathetic. The complexities surrounding the real economy, the movement of goods, services and peoples between bioregions, requires serious consideration on the part of everyone involved. I'd suggest the gentler readers come away with me from this section with a few key aspects in mind. In the current interbioregional trade, and indeed trade in general, is essentially an abstracted bartering system. Trading doesn't happen if the other parties involved do not have goods or services that are needed, wanted, or desired at the moment of the trading. Money is used to abstract this, and does enable trading that isn't directly done for goods or services. Still, money as a requirement means there is still an indirect requirement for there being some good or service that person has provided to someone, somewhere, somewhen, in a rather direct manner. Those kinds of requirements gum up a free movement of goods and services towards the ends of meeting the needs, wants and desires of people, creating all the rather crazed interbioregional trading we see in the current, and much of the ecological horrors in the world. The removal of money and the utilization of bioregionally bound constraints is the proposed solution. In essence, the trading of goods and services on the understanding that others are trading their goods and services, regardless of if they are being directly or indirectly traded with you in particular, whomever you so happen to be. The proper framing for such trading of goods and services provides the relevant guardrails and systemization of trading, rather specifically, the mechanic of freely chosen labor, the limit of renewal rates of resources, and the constraints of bioregionally bound but not thereby limited structures. Much of the remainder of this series covers the various relevant theoretical operati, objections, and benefits for doing so. The best I can do is provide a proper framework to functionally, iteratively operate well and towards the good as a species, and put it forth for folks. Such perhaps is the role of philosophy after all. The actual doing of the things, the making time to read through this sort of stuff, to take it seriously enough to be of concern, and indeed, seriously enough to take action, is up to others. I can provide a head out of ass removal system. Others need to actualize it lest their heads remain firmly up their own or someone else's ass. Or, we can just watch the world burn together.
What you say?